Hello, I'm Libby Hill, and I want to talk today about the intersection between autism, pDA, and selective mutism. So I've called it, It's Part of His Autism, Isn't it? Sometimes that can be a teacher asking that question, sometimes it's a parent, sometimes it's another professional, and usually it's asked with the best intentions. So they've noticed that the young person talks happily at home. Maybe they chat endlessly about Minecraft or trains or Taylor Swift, but they arrive at school and suddenly cannot speak. Or perhaps they can answer mum, but not dad. Maybe they can whisper to one teaching assistant, but not another. Maybe they can speak in one classroom, but become completely silent in another. And people often wonder, is it his autism? Is it the pDA kicking in? And today I'd like to suggest that the answer is yes and no, because autism absolutely changes how communication looks. So does demand avoidance. Both change sensory processing, how uncertainty is experienced. It changes how demands are perceived, and it changes how much energy communication requires. But that doesn't mean that we should assume that every communication difficulty is simply part of autism. Sometimes we're also seeing something else, something that needs to be recognised in its own right: selective mutism. And over the next half hour, I'd like us to explore where autism with or without a pDA profile and selective mutism overlap, where they differ, and why recognising both can completely change how we support children and young people. So this is where we're going today. First, I'd like to think a little bit about the language we use, because words do matter, because the labels we choose influence assessments, they influence intervention and funding. Then I'd like to think about communication through a slightly different lens, not why won't they talk, but what's preventing communication from being accessible right now. So we'll look briefly at the polyvagal theory, because I think that gives us a really helpful way of understanding why speech can disappear when a nervous system no longer feels safe. I'm going to introduce you to my new framework called the Safe Steps Framework, which some of you might already know. And I'm going to explain why, for autistic people, I don't think we need an entirely new intervention model, but I think we need a different starting point. And then I'll just share a couple of real case examples, because I think that's where theory becomes more meaningful. So I'm hoping that you leave today thinking slightly differently. So if you have a child or you work with a child with pDA who is not speaking, instead of thinking, how can we get them to talk? I want you to think, how can we make communication possible? So why do I still say selective mutism when many people believe it should be called situational? Now, I completely understand why people would prefer it to be called situational, because it's the situation that's actually causing their inability to speak. But selective does not mean that they're choosing when to speak. That isn't what's happening. They're not making a conscious decision at all. If they could speak, they would speak. But the selective part means non-pervasive. It means not all the time. That's all it means. So I'm still using that term because that's the term in the DSM-5 and the ICD-11. So they're the diagnostic manuals that we talk about a lot with pDA because it's not in there yet. So when I'm writing that, I have to write that. I might put in brackets, also known as, but I need it to be the right terminology, because if we abandon that diagnostic term before something else replaces it, we risk the children losing recognition rather than gaining it. So I've had a lot of local authorities in tribunal say, well, the speech therapist said it was situational mutism, so we don't need to work on that because it's the situation that's causing it. So for me, it's not about defending a word, it's about protecting access to support. And I think we can do both. So we can explain that selective means context dependent, not chosen. And it's a subtle difference, but it matters enormously. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings is assuming that because a child can speak somewhere, they can speak everywhere. And I was thinking about it, and we'd never say that because someone can walk around their house, that they should then also be able to climb a mountain. And it's the same thing, really. So let's just make sure we're talking about the same things. So when I'm talking about autism with or without a pDA profile, I'm not talking about a disorder that needs fixing. I'm just talking about a different way of experiencing the world. Differences in social communication, differences in sensory processing, differences in how uncertainty is experienced or how energy is used. It's not simply about social interaction. It's about how every piece of information is processed. And if we think about selective mutism, it's not shyness, it's not defiance, it's not rudeness or poor parenting, and it certainly isn't manipulation, because that's another one I hear. It's context dependent inability to speak. Notice I said inability, not unwillingness, because they usually know exactly what they want to say. The language is there, the thoughts are there, but at that moment, their nervous system just won't allow that to happen. And this is where polyvagal theory gives us such a helpful explanation. So, how often do they overlap? So, often I'm asked, can autism and selective mutism go together? And you'll know with pDA, it goes together a lot. So the answer is absolutely, and much more than people realise. So research suggests that it's around 13 to 35% of children who are diagnosed with selective mutism also meet the criteria for autism. There's nothing yet on the pDA aspect of it. Now that's quite a broad range, isn't it? 13 to 35. Why is that? So different studies have used different populations and different diagnostic methods, but whichever paper you read, that is a significant overlap. And it's too common to dismiss as a mere coincidence. Interestingly, when I surveyed 505 teenagers with selective mutism, around a quarter also identified as autistic or had an autism diagnosis. And that made me stop and think, because those young people often described something that felt slightly different from what I'd seen in children with selective mutism alone. So they weren't simply anxious about talking. They weren't afraid of talking. It wasn't a phobia of talking as often been described. Many of them said, I'm not scared of talking, I just can't. Others described it as constant sensory overload, constantly trying to work out social expectations, masking all day, monitoring facial expressions, trying to interpret language, managing uncertainty, coping with demands that never seem to end. And then someone asked them a question. So it was almost as if speech was the final straw. And that really changed my thinking. Maybe we should be asking, how much is this nervous system already carrying before speech is expected? And for me, this is where autism changes the picture. Not because speech therapy suddenly comes different. I did think at one point that it did, but it's the starting point that's different. So if autism with or without pDA changes the starting point, the next obvious question is, how do we understand what the nervous system is doing at that moment? And that's why I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes thinking about polyvagal theory. Because if a child or young person is in sympathetic nervous system state, so they're triggered for the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, they're not in a position where they are available for very much speech. They're taken out of that social zone. They're saving their lives, basically. They're surviving at that particular point. Now, this is the stages of confident speaking that Maggie Johnson and Alison Wingens put together. But many of you have already seen this, and I'm not here to replace that at all, because sometimes I think in my profession, we become obsessed with inventing something entirely new. But good models don't need replacing, but they do need understanding. So this has actually helped thousands of children increase their confidence in speaking. And I think it remains one of the most practical ways of planning intervention. But notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't jump straight into speech. It recognises that communication develops gradually. So children move from no communication to engagement, to gesture, to sounds, to words, to sentences, before eventually communicating freely to different people in different places. And that's great about what we know about anxiety reduction. So we're looking for progress to happen in tiny achievable steps. And that's absolutely something I want to preserve. But I do think that autistic children often arrive somewhere different, because many have spent years trying to cope with sensory overload, executive function demands, social uncertainty, masking, and fatigue. So although this still works, I don't think they're always standing on the first rung, because sometimes they haven't even reached the ladder yet. And that's where I wanted to do a safe steps model. So not as a replacement, just a different way of helping autistic children, especially those with a pDA profile, to reach that bottom rung safely. So this is a typical roadmap for neurotypical implementation. So obviously every child is different, but it often follows a pattern like this. So we begin an audit, reduce the pressure, help adults to understand what selective mutism is. We make some environmental changes. And once anxiety begins to reduce, we move on to that non-verbal engagement. Not asking for speech, though. We're not doing anything like that, but we are building relationships. We're creating predictability, and we're helping the nervous system discover that this place, these people, this routine is safe. And only then do we begin to introduce tiny vocalizations, a cough, a hum, a whisper, a single word, and then we gradually build from there. Works beautifully. But then I noticed more autistic people, and I realized that they weren't progressing through that roadmap in the way we expected. Not because the intervention was wrong, because something else was happening before we even started. So that's when I realized that actually maybe speech isn't the whole story. Perhaps the nervous system was already overwhelmed long before anybody expected speech. And that's really where the polyvagal theory helped me make sense of what I was seeing. Now, there's some old behaviourist pitfalls that we really want to leave behind. And I always feel slightly nervous showing this slide, because many of us, including me in my earlier career, used some of these approaches. Not because we didn't care, but that's what we were taught. So it isn't about blame, but it is about learning. So if we look at token rewards, we know what you will all think about what would happen if you gave a token reward for your child. The thing is, what we're doing anyway, even if they hadn't got pDA, we're accidentally turning survival into a performance target. So imagine offering somebody a chocolate bar when they're having a panic attack. Wouldn't that be great if they stopped panicking? But it wouldn't work, would it? Because it misses what's actually happening inside their body. So basically, all these behaviourist things that happen, really, we need to put in the past. Now, one of the biggest shifts in my own practice has been realizing that the absence of speech is actually information. It's telling us something. It isn't the problem, it's the clue. So instead of trying to remove the silence, I now spend much more time asking, what is the silence protecting this young person from? Sometimes the answer is social anxiety, sometimes sensory overload, sometimes uncertainty, sometimes cumulative demands. But often, especially with the pDAs, it's all of them together. And that is why one size intervention is not going to work. So if behaviour is not the starting point and speech isn't the starting point, what is? Well, for me, the answer is safety. Not just emotional safety, not just physical safety, but nervous system safety. So let's just have a think about that, because my view is that communication is not a behaviour to be managed. It's a capacity to be supported. So we need to talk about values, considerations that we need to make now we're being far more neurodivergent affirming. So before we talk about the strategies, let's look at the values, because every intervention is built upon assumptions, and sometimes we don't actually realise what those assumptions are. So one assumption might be, for instance, good therapy helped children become like everyone else. That's never been my goal, I have to say. My goal is not to make autistic children appear neurotypical. My goal is to enable them to communicate successfully, to support them into doing that while being their authentic self. That's a very different starting point. And there are 4 principles that underpin everything, sorry. So it sounds obvious, but people are often, I find, wanting to get them to the next stage. How do we get them to the next stage? And parents feel that pressure too, I know. When will they start talking? When will they answer the register? When will they make friends? And they are very understandable questions, but children can only begin from where they actually are, not from where we hope they'll be. Sometimes progress might just simply be walking into the classroom. Sometimes it's staying for 5 extra minutes. Sometimes it's looking at another person. Sometimes it's writing instead of speaking. But every one of those things is communication, and we must recognise each one of those. The next thing is supporting the nervous system. And this has been the biggest change in my own thinking. So I focused much more on communication behaviours. Now I find myself asking, what state is this nervous system in? Because the communication doesn't happen in isolation. It depends on regulation. If the nervous system is overwhelmed, language simply becomes harder to access. Working memory becomes less efficient. Processing slows. Executive functioning becomes more difficult. Speech can disappear altogether. So before we teach communication, we have to support regulation. And another new way of thinking is that all communication is valid. So we have been very, very fixated on the fact that speech is the only way, and the best way, the only way. And many of the autistic community, including some of those with pDA, they actually call spoken language mouth words. And mouth words is just one form of communication. So, writing, AAC, gesture, typing, facial expression, movement, they're all communication. And sometimes professionals accidentally communicate that speech is the gold standard. But I don't believe that. The goal isn't spoken language. The goal is participation. And if a young person successfully tells us that they're overwhelmed using a phone, to my mind, that's successful communication. The last one that we really need to think about now, we're being far more neurodivergent affirming, is presuming competence. And that's probably the most important principle of all, because silence doesn't tell us what someone understands. Lack of speech doesn't tell us what someone knows. Those with selective mutism often understand everything because they're listening, they're thinking, they're learning. They are simply unable to demonstrate it in the usual way. And that's why we should always presume competence. Not because we know exactly what someone understands, but the cost of underestimating someone is actually so much greater than the cost of believing in them. So once we look at these 4 principles and start from there, everything else changes, including how we think about the nervous system themselves. Now, I promise not to turn this into a neuroscience lecture because I can get a bit carried away when I'm talking about this. But I think that the polyvagal theory is only useful if it changes practice. So for me, it provides a language for explaining something that parents have been telling us for years. So they'll often say, he could talk yesterday. She was chatting all evening. He answered the phone at home. She suddenly couldn't speak. This isn't inconsistent. It's exactly what we would expect if communication depends on nervous system state. So when we're in ventral vagal state, our brains are available for connection. We're curious, playful, flexible. Communication flows much more easily. We want that interaction. As stress increases, the sympathetic nervous system prepares us to survive. So heart rate increases, attention narrows, the body starts asking, am I safe? Not what's the best sentence to say. Communication in this state will become so much harder. And if that overwhelm continues, some young people then move into dorsal vagal shutdown. This is autistic burnout, really. And people often describe it beautifully as she disappears or he just freezes. It's like nobody's home. She can't even answer me. And those descriptions are remarkably consistent. Now, I want to be careful because polyvagal theory is still evolving and researchers are continuing to debate some aspects of the model. But clinically, I think it gives families an incredibly compassionate explanation. Not won't they talk or they won't talk, but right now their nervous system can't prioritize communication. And that's actually a profoundly different message. So for those of you supporting young people with a pDA profile, this is probably very familiar. As demands rise, communication falls. Not because they're refusing, but because their nervous system is moving further away from feeling safe enough to communicate. And that's why reducing demands so often has a dramatic effect. It's not giving in, it's creating access. And that's what brings me to what has become the central idea in my own clinical practice. So it's the same ladder, but a different start. So I'm not suggesting we throw away everything we've learned about selective mutism, still use Maggie and Alison's ladder. I still use shaping sometimes. I actually still use sliding in if that's what the young person wants to do. I might use graded exposure. But what's changed is where I begin. So imagine 2 children arriving in my clinic, both have selective mutism. One has no additional neurodevelopmental differences. The other is autistic with a pDA profile. On paper, they're both stage 3. But are they really starting in the same place? I don't think they are, because one child arrives with social anxiety, but the other one may be carrying sensory overload, cumulative demands, you know about those well, masking fatigue, uncertainty, executive function loss, interoception confusion, previous experiences of failure. maybe exhaustion from simply getting through the day. So by the time we've actually asked for speech, they've run a marathon. So I don't change the destination, but I do change the journey. So I make the steps smaller and I spend much longer building safety. Because often when we do that, something remarkable happens. Speech starts to emerge naturally, not because we chased it or forced it, but because we created the conditions where communication became accessible again. And for me, well, that's what Safe Steps is really about. So that's my new model. It's not teaching speech, it's creating the conditions where speech no longer feels impossible. Because speech isn't the first sign that therapy is working, safety is. And that's actually the most important thing I'd like you to take away from today. So this is my new model. It's a framework I've gradually developed over many years. And when I first started, like everybody else, I thought the goal of therapy was speech, but now I don't. I think speech is an outcome, but it's not an intervention. It's not a target. It's an outcome. Because communication grows when conditions are right. So let's have a look at these 5 stages. So the first one, stabilize. Everything begins here. Not with speech, not with exposure, not with asking questions, but with creating an environment where the nervous system begins to feel safe. Predictability, low demand, sensory awareness, and adults who understand this, adults who stop asking, can you say hello? Instead, they might say, you don't have to speak today, we're just glad you're here. Because that one sentence can actually completely change the atmosphere. Removing pressure before we've even started. Step 2 is about engaging non-verbally. So once the environment feels safer, we begin to build relationships. Notice I haven't said we begin building speech yet. We build relationships, shared activities, shared interests, games, drawing, walking, Lego, Minecraft, Pokemon, football stickers, Roblox, whatever genuinely matters to that young person. Why? Because it's the relationships that regulate nervous systems. When children feel understood, communication often begins changing before we've done anything directly about speech. Step 3 is where we might now look at producing voice. And we would start off with thinking about voice, tiny sounds, breathing, whispers, single words, always without pressure, always with a choice, always knowing that if speech doesn't happen today, therapy has still been successful, because success is not measured by words. It's measured by whether the child leaves feeling safer than when they arrived. Step 4 would be expanding it. So once speech feels comfortable, then we would widen the audience, maybe one new adult, one new room, only one step at a time, one variable at a time. And then the last bit is generalizing and self-advocating. So, that ultimate goal is for them to be their authentic self and to be able to self-advocate. But that's the end point. It's actually not fluent conversation. It's about meaningful participation in life. So if you remember nothing else from this framework, just remember this. Speech is at the top, safety is at the bottom. And when we reverse these priorities, as we have, everything else becomes easier. So let's make it practical. What does stabilizing actually look like in school? Schools always ask, where should we begin? And my answer often surprises them. Usually I don't say books on speech and language therapy. I say, let's walk around the school. Because communication happens inside environments, and environments can either support communication or quietly make it impossible. So take the visual timetable. So To many children, it's just a timetable. To an autistic child, it might be the difference between spending all morning worrying about what's coming next or feeling able to relax enough to learn. With pDA, it might have to look much more like the teacher's diary, otherwise they might feel they're being patronised. So we've always got that balance with pDA. But think about a quiet lunch base. Some people have said to me, but aren't we avoiding the problem? And I ask a different question. I say, is the canteen currently teaching communication or overwhelming the nervous system? And sometimes the bravest thing a child does all day is simply staying in school. So giving them somewhere calm to recover is not about lowering your expectations. It's about increasing access. And then the next thing, when I say, please, no hands up questioning, or, let the person volunteer if they want to, because so many, particularly I was talking to someone with pDA last week, and he said he spends the whole lesson worrying that the teacher might suddenly ask him something. So actually he said, I'm not listening to the lesson anymore, and what he's doing is monitoring danger. So if we can remove that uncertainty and know that nobody's going to cold call like that, their attention often comes back. So the lesson hasn't changed, but the nervous system is making things more accessible. So one of the things that really struck me in my own work was how often communication improved after environmental changes alone. Before we'd used shaping or sliding in or done anything specifically about their speech, sometimes changing the environment changes the communication. So before we ask, how do we teach communication, perhaps we should ask, how communicatively accessible is this environment? One of the most powerful things we can do is do a communication passport. So imagine you're 12 years old, you have a pDA profile, you have selective mutism, you've finally built trust in your class teacher, and they're off sick. A supply teacher walks in. They don't know you. They call your name. Everyone turns round. Instantly, everything you've built disappears. Not because the therapy failed, but because the information didn't travel. And that's why just a simple one-page passport, not pages and pages of reports, one page, written with the young person in their own words wherever possible. Because these tiny details can completely change a child's day. Suddenly, every adult is responding consistently, and consistency creates the safety. I often ask them to put on their 3 helps and 3 hinders, just so people can really personalise it. Adults can remember 6 things, they've proved that. They won't remember 60, but sometimes the simplest supports are the ones that get used. Of course, adults aren't the only people who influence communication. Peers do too, and that's where I'd like to go next. So if we look at, sensory and auditory demand, this is one of the biggest changes in my practice, has been realising that communication never happens in isolation. It happens in an environment, and every environment makes demands. Sometimes we think of demand as work, so it could, completing a worksheet or answering a question, writing an essay. But actually, for many of our PDAs, demand starts much earlier than that. Walking through a noisy corridor, the fluorescent lights, the smell of lunch drifting through school, the unpredictability about who's on duty, wondering whether someone will ask a direct question, trying to work out what facial expression the teacher is expecting. So by 9 o'clock, some children have obviously spent an enormous amount of energy just coping. And then we ask them to communicate. That can be a huge thing. So a walk around the school, you can look for the bottlenecks. Ideally, an OT will have done this for you, but if they haven't, where does everybody have to squeeze together? I don't like that either. Where are the echoes? Which classrooms are visually cluttered? Because these are often the places where communication becomes least accessible. And I also ask staff, which lessons seem easiest, which lessons seem hardest. And often the answer is not about the subject, it's about the communication load. So those lessons with things like group discussion, reading aloud, oral feedback, open-ended questions, working with unfamiliar partners, those lessons require such an enormous amount of executive functioning. So our first job is not to teach speech, it's reducing unnecessary communication demand. And often something wonderful happens when we do that. They often start communicating more without anybody ever asking them to. So the biggest clinical lesson I think I've learned in this is that children rarely fail because they are unwilling to communicate. It's the environment is asking more than their nervous systems can currently give. So when we've created a safer environment, then we're ready to think about relationships, because the relationships are one of the most powerful regulators we have. So if we think about peers, sometimes a young person does not want the peers to be involved in everything, but peers can be one of the most underused resources we have. You know, the other children have noticed the differences, but sometimes they've made up their own explanations for why they're not able to talk. So they might think, she doesn't like us, he's ignoring us, she's rude, he thinks he's better than everyone else and doesn't need to talk to us. You know, so those misunderstandings can create more pressure. So I like to give peers a very simple explanation. Some people's words get stuck when they're anxious. You don't need to rescue them. You don't need to keep asking them to speak. Just include them as you would anybody else. And particularly primary school children are actually very quick to take that on board. They seem to get it. And I also sometimes talk about buddy etiquette, because there's one rule I always, emphasize, and that is include, but don't pressure. And there's a huge difference with that. So many children with pDA have often said that what hurts most is not being unable to speak. It's being left out completely. So we talk about, keep inviting them, keep including, keep expecting them to belong. Just don't expect speech to be the price of belonging. And that's quite important. So for young people with a pDA profile, feeling socially trapped can be just as overwhelming as adult demands. Peer understanding reduces another layer of uncertainty. And once uncertainty reduces, communication often becomes easier. So what does this look like in practice? Well, if we look at Amir, so he is autistic with a pDA profile and selective mutism. He was in year 9. And when I first met him, he communicated very little in school. But we didn't talk. We spent time discovering what mattered to him. Football, statistics, league tables, player ratings, transfer rumours, FIFA. He knew everything. And the important bit, when he talked about football, the communication demand changed. He didn't feel that the conversation was a test. It became sharing information about something he genuinely loved. And that actually changed everything. And he wanted to try sliding in. But we weren't really asking him to perform socially. We were inviting him to share his expertise. And to begin with, the conversations were whispered after a little while and then became spoken words, then became conversations. Now, he actually, in about 10 weeks, had moved from whispering to using his voice with familiar adults. It wasn't that it was the football that was magic and a magic cure. The football was the bridge. So his special interest was the bridge. And it gave his nervous system somewhere safe to stand while the communication became slowly more accessible. And, special interests aren't distractions. They're one of the most powerful communication tools we have. And that's exactly what we need if communication is going to flourish. I'll say that word. But of course, not everyone responds in that same way, because someone like This child, Lena, she taught us something different. So by the time I met her, again, pDA profile, autism ADHD, she was in year 11. And on paper, everyone had focused on her selective mutism. But when we really started listening, it became obvious that speech was not the biggest problem. Her nervous system was exhausted. Every school day involved trying to filter noise, trying to stay organised, trying to remember what she needed, trying to mask, trying to cope with constant demands, trying to avoid making mistakes. By lunchtime, she had virtually nothing left. So when someone expected speech, there simply wasn't the capacity. And I think that's something that we sometimes miss. Communication doesn't happen separately from everything else. It competes with everything else. Executive function, attention, sensory processing, emotional regulation, motor planning, all of those are drawing from the same battery. So when that battery becomes depleted, speech is often the first thing to disappear. So what did we change with Lena? Well, interestingly, very little directly on her speech. We reduced the sensory load, created opportunities to rehearse privately. Voice notes were a brilliant stepping stone for her. Nobody was waiting, nobody was watching, nobody expected an immediate response anymore. She could record and delete if she wanted to, start again, start back, listen back, and gradually became comfortable hearing her own voice. Eventually, those voice notes actually became conversations. And she completed a recorded GCSE oral assessment, not because we'd pushed harder, but because we made communication feel safer. But what she taught me is that sometimes what can look like a lack of confidence is actually cognitive overload, and they are not the same thing. So we actually, previously I would have said sliding in doesn't work, because if we go straight for sliding in, when somebody's nervous system is stretched to capacity, you're adding load. So we would only do this when we know that they're ready for it. And it's usually the child or the young person that asks rather than me. But we used interest-based tasks, literal scripts, stable sensory input, one change at a time. She did really well. We need to change things if a child is autistic. We need to change again, knowing their pDA profile and how they like to be handled or dealt with or whatever. Supported, I suppose, is the right word. But it's really important that we tweak things to personalize it. So that brings us on to shaping. So again, shaping can be a really useful thing to do with a pDA. It can be really tiny progress. So it can start with breathing or a hum, just noticing our breath. So sometimes it's making funny noises together. Sometimes it's whispering behind the screen. One sound can build to one word. And it can feel incredibly slow for some, but if people are asking when will they speak, they're going to be disappointed, because our job isn't about producing speech. It's about building the confidence, the safety, and that will bring the success. I want them to see that maybe talking isn't dangerous after all. And that's very different from forcing speech when their nervous system's already stretched. She really enjoyed using a decibel meter. So it was just an app on her phone, and she could do it on her own. She could practice away from anybody. But actually, that worked really, really well for her. But children need us to be patient enough to let confidence grow at a pace that their nervous system can manage. Tiny steps are still steps, and sometimes they're actually the bravest steps of all. Now, selective mutism and supporting a child or a young person with pDA with selective mutism is not the role of just one person. We need the SENCO to coordinate the hub and the team and keep the whole picture coordinated. The speech and language therapist needs to set and review the targets across the school. The ed site can provide guidance. And the occupational therapist, I think, has become increasingly important in this work, because if sensory overload is preventing communication, then sensory regulation is not an optional extra. It's part of the communication intervention. The same is true of emotional regulation, interoception, motor planning. Everything connects. And CAMS, mental health support, can be essential, but it's really important that everyone is working towards the same understanding. Otherwise, families can get conflicting advice. So CAMS need to understand about selective mutism, because I still get terrible feedback that people think it's a choice. And of course, parents know their child better than anybody else. They know what works, they know what doesn't. They know the subtle signs that communication is becoming easier long before anybody else notices. And we should never underestimate that expertise. They've had years of training. So perhaps the most important member of the team is obviously the young person themselves. So they must always have a voice in planning support, even if it's not a spoken voice. So what does success actually look like? Well, this is a slide that I would like people to remember, because sometimes we can measure success too narrowly. So if speech is our outcome, we're missing so much progress. So if we're thinking differently, functional communication, for instance, success means, can this person get their needs met? Can they ask for help? Can they say when they're overwhelmed? Can they tell us when they're confused? Can they participate in whatever way works for them? If the answer is yes, that's successful communication, however they're doing it. And the next mark might be reduced shutdowns. Sometimes the greatest sign of progress isn't more talking, it's fewer shutdowns. Self-advocacy. This is where I'd ultimately like all the young people to arrive. But being able to say, I need a break. It's too noisy. Can you write it down? Can you say that again? I don't want to do this. That's much more important than answering the register. And sometimes I think, have we been asking the wrong question? Instead of can they talk, perhaps we should be asking, can they participate? Because that's really what changes lives. And that brings me to my final thoughts, really. So if you've heard nothing else today, I'd like you to remember 3 things. Keep the ladder. Don't throw everything we know about selective mutism away because they have pDA. The evidence is good. The principles still work, but we've got to make the rungs smaller. Those, especially with a pDA profile, need much smaller rungs. And it's not about reducing your expectation. It's about improving access. And start with safety, not behaviour, not compliance, safety. Speech is the final outcome, not the first intervention. And if I'm honest, this isn't really about changing selective mutism therapy. It's about changing how we think. So earlier in my career, I spent a lot of time thinking about how can I encourage speech? Now I spend much more time asking, what is preventing communication today? And that single question has actually changed almost everything I do. So I'd like to finish where I started. Do you remember the question at the beginning? When I said, is it part of his autism? And I think the answer still is yes and no. Yes, autism, particularly with a pDA profile, changes communication, but it changes sensory processing, executive function, attention, uncertainty, the amount of effort required. But no, it doesn't mean we should stop recognizing selective mutism when it's there, because when we recognize both, we intervene differently. We become more patient. We reduce the demands. We create more predictability. We spend more time helping the nervous system feel safe. And then, something rather lovely happens. Speech often appears almost quietly because nobody's chasing it or forcing it anymore, particularly with the pDAs. So I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Perhaps our role isn't to teach children to talk. Perhaps our role is to create environments, relationships, experiences where communication becomes possible. Because when children genuinely feel safe, they rarely need persuading to communicate. They simply begin. Thank you very much for listening.